The desert stretched for miles in every direction, silent and empty except for the wind that whispered across the sand. Beneath the golden waves of dust lay something ancient, something long forgotten. People passed through the area without ever knowing what rested below their feet. Only a few old records spoke of a lost defense base buried after the Great War, a base that was once the last hope of humanity. Most believed it was a myth, just another story told by old travelers near campfires. But the truth was sleeping under the desert, waiting for someone to wake it. The story began when a small group of explorers arrived in the old desert zone known as Sector 9. They were not soldiers or treasure hunters, just a group of researchers from a small university. The leader, Dr. Myra Elson, had spent years studying wartime ruins. Her partner, Jacob, handled all the digging and scanning work. There was also a young assistant, Leo, who joined them because he loved old stories of the war. They had no idea what they were about to uncover. For weeks, they searched the sand dunes under the burning sun, finding nothing but metal scraps and dry bones of old machines. Then, one night, their scanner detected a large structure hidden under the surface, far deeper than any of them expected. The next morning, the wind was strong, and the sun was harsh, but the team worked fast. Jacob's drill hit something hard beneath the sand, and a dull sound echoed like a hollow drum. They brushed the dust away and revealed a metallic surface, covered in strange marks and symbols. The metal was not rusted, it looked almost alive, shining faintly even under the dirt. Myra's eyes widened. She whispered that it was not human-made, or at least not by modern hands. Leo recorded everything, his hands shaking with excitement. He asked if this could be part of the forgotten base people talked about. Myra did not answer. She only stared at the strange surface as if she could feel it looking back at her. As the sun went down, they set up lights around the dig site. The wind carried the sound of sand scraping against metal. Jacob managed to open a small panel on the surface and found a passage going down. Cold air flowed out of the hole, strange and dry like the breath of something that had slept for a long time. Myra wanted to wait until morning, but Leo could not resist. He climbed down with his flashlight, calling for the others to follow. The tunnel was narrow and steep, covered in dust but made of strong black metal. At the bottom, Leo found a door half open, leading into a large dark chamber. When they entered the chamber, the air smelled of iron and time. Their flashlights revealed huge machines standing silent, covered in layers of dust. Some looked like weapons, others like giant armored suits. Leo walked toward one of the machines and brushed the dust from its surface. It had a human shape, but taller, heavier, and made of some kind of alloy he had never seen. The chest plate bore an emblem of a broken circle. Myra recognized it immediately. It was the mark of the defenders, the elite soldiers who fought in the last days of the Great War. She whispered that every defender had vanished when the final battle ended. Nobody ever found their bodies or their machines. Maybe they were here, she said quietly. Maybe they were never destroyed, only buried. Suddenly, a soft sound filled the room, like static from an old radio. Then another noise followed, a slow mechanical hum. The ground trembled slightly under their feet. Leo turned off his flashlight for a moment and saw faint blue lights flickering inside the machines. Jacob shouted that they should leave, but Myra stood frozen, staring at the awakening machines. She said softly that something was still alive down here. The hum grew louder, echoing through the dark corridors. Dust fell from the ceiling as if the entire place was taking a breath after a long sleep. They ran back to the tunnel entrance, but the path behind them started to close. Metal panels slid down from the walls, sealing the passage. Jacob tried to stop it, but his hand got caught in the falling debris. Leo pulled him free, shouting in panic. They barely escaped before the final panel shut tight. Outside, the sandstorm had grown stronger, covering the entrance again. They stood gasping for air, watching as the ground moved slightly beneath them. Myra looked back, her face pale but her eyes bright with fear and wonder. She said that they had just woken something that was never meant to wake. Leo asked what she thought was inside. Myra replied that if the stories were true, those were not just machines. They were soldiers built to protect humanity, waiting for a signal that never came. Now, after centuries, they might think the war was still going on. The wind howled louder, carrying the sound of metal grinding deep below the sand. The team packed their equipment in silence, but nobody dared to leave. The desert was quiet again, Yet something was moving under their feet, something aware, something remembering an old command. The defenders beneath the dust were no longer forgotten. They were waking up. The night grew colder as the sandstorm began to fade. Myra, Jacob, and Leo sat near their tent, staring at the place where the ground had moved earlier. The wind carried a faint mechanical hum from below, a steady pulse like a heartbeat under the sand. None of them spoke for a while. The fire crackled weakly between them, throwing shadows across their faces. Leo kept glancing at the scanner's screen. The signal it showed was strange, many shapes moving slowly underground, gathering near the same point where they had been digging. Myra leaned closer, studying the patterns. She whispered that they looked like coordinated movement, not random shifts of sand. Jacob said maybe it was just the storm confusing the readings, but even he didn't believe his own words. When the storm finally stopped, the desert became silent again. Myra decided they had to go back down. She said if the base had reactivated, they needed to see it before anyone else did. Jacob refused at first, saying the machines could be dangerous, but Myra reminded him that they might be the only people to witness something lost for hundreds of years. Leo agreed with her. His voice trembled with excitement as he packed his gear. He wanted to record everything, to show the world what they had found. As dawn touched the horizon, they returned to the site. The sand had covered most of the entrance again, but the ground still vibrated softly under their boots. Jacob used the drill to open the passage once more. This time, the metal seemed warmer, almost alive to the touch. When they climbed down, the air was clearer, not as dusty as before. The lights inside the chamber were glowing faintly, blue and white lines running along the walls like veins. The machines they saw earlier were no longer still. Some stood upright now, their heads turning slowly, their eyes glowing with cold light. The team froze. One of the giant figures turned toward them. It did not move closer, only watched. Its chest emitted a low mechanical tone, and strange symbols appeared on the wall behind it. Myra whispered that it was a communication code, the same language the defenders used during the war. She remembered studying it in old military archives. She pulled out her tablet and began translating. The message repeated over and over, signal lost. Awaiting command. Defensive mode active. Jacob's face turned pale. He asked what that meant. Myra said it meant they were waiting for orders that never came, still following a mission from centuries ago. Leo stepped closer to one of the machines. He held up a small camera and tried to speak to it, asking if it could understand him. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the machine's lights flickered. Its chest opened slightly, revealing an old identification badge inside, sealed behind glass. The name read, Commander Aries Vaughn, Human Defense Unit. Leo looked at Myra in disbelief. She explained that Commander Vaughn was a real historical figure, the last known leader of the Defenders. History said he died in the final battle. Yet here his machine stood, still functional. The ground shook again, stronger this time. The machines began moving in unison, their heavy steps echoing through the corridors. The dust from the ceiling fell like rain. Myra realized they were activating the defense systems. She shouted for everyone to get back. Suddenly, metal doors opened across the hall, revealing long tunnels filled with more machines, lined in perfect rows. They were waking in sequence, one after another. A deep mechanical voice echoed through the base, speaking the same message in an old robotic tone, threat detected. Defense protocol initiated. Myra's heart pounded. She shouted that they needed to leave before the system identified them as intruders. They ran toward the exit, but the same metal panels that had trapped them before began to slide down again. Leo dropped his camera while running. It hit the floor and broke, but the red light stayed on, still recording. As they climbed up the tunnel, the air grew warmer. Sparks flew from the walls as the defense systems powered up. Jacob reached the top first and pulled Myra up after him. When Leo reached for her hand, something caught his leg. A metal cable shot from below and wrapped around his boot. Myra grabbed him and pulled with all her strength. The cable snapped, leaving a piece of metal clinging to Leo's shoe. They all stumbled back onto the surface, gasping for air. The ground behind them shook again, and a loud metallic roar echoed from below. The sand around the site began to rise in small waves, as if something enormous was pushing upward. Myra turned on her tablet again, trying to connect with the base system through the signal she recorded earlier. For a brief moment, her screen filled with lines of data. She could see the system identifying them, scanning for threats. The code on her tablet changed rapidly, and then a single phrase appeared on the screen: "Command authority not recognized." The words repeated, flashing faster and faster. She realized the machines did not know who they were. To them, anything not part of their command was an enemy. Jacob shouted that they had to move before the machines reached the surface. They ran across the dunes, their shadows stretching long under the rising sun. Behind them, the ground cracked open. A metallic hand broke through the sand, followed by another. The sound of gears grinding filled the air. The defenders were climbing out, one by one, their armor shining under the morning light. Leo turned back for one last look and whispered that maybe they were not enemies, maybe they were still trying to defend something. Myra watched in silence. She could feel the desert trembling as the old soldiers rose again, obeying commands that time had forgotten. The defenders beneath the dust were no longer hidden. They were awake, confused, and ready for war once more. The sun rose higher over the endless desert, painting the sand in shades of gold and red. Myra, Jacob, and Leo kept running until their legs burned, but even from miles away they could still hear the deep metallic sound behind them. The defenders were moving. It was slow at first, like heavy machines struggling to remember how to walk, but the sound was steady and growing stronger. The team stopped near a cluster of rocks, gasping for air. Myra turned on her tablet again. The signal from the base was still active, spreading wider every minute. It was sending something into the air, a pulse that repeated every few seconds. She didn't know what it meant, but she could feel it wasn't random. It was calling out to something. Jacob sat down, wiping sweat from his forehead. He said they needed to contact someone, maybe the government or the military. Myra shook her head. She said nobody would believe them without proof. Besides, if those machines were still running old defense programs, any outside force might trigger a larger response. Leo looked back toward the horizon. The dust was rising in thick waves. He could see large shapes moving within it, tall, heavy, almost human. He raised his camera, the backup one he always carried, and zoomed in. Through the dust, he saw 5 figures walking in formation, their armor shining faintly blue. They were not running or attacking, just marching in a straight line, scanning the land around them. It was like they were searching for something. Myra studied the scene through her binoculars. She noticed one of the defenders was carrying a device on its arm, projecting light beams into the air. The beams formed symbols she couldn't fully understand, but she recognized one, an old war symbol for distress. She whispered that maybe they thought the war was still happening, that they were trying to find their commanders or their enemies. Leo said quietly that maybe they still believed humanity was in danger. Myra lowered her binoculars and said that if they didn't stop those machines, they might start a battle against anything that moved. Jacob started unpacking some tools from his bag. He said maybe they could disable the signal coming from the base. If they stopped it, maybe the defenders would stop too. Myra hesitated. She knew that returning to the base meant going back into danger, but she also knew it might be their only chance to prevent something worse. Leo agreed. He said he would rather face the machines underground again than wait for them to reach a city. Myra looked at both of them and nodded. They gathered their things and began walking back. By the time they reached the dig site, the desert air felt heavier. The sand moved slightly, as if vibrating with the pulse coming from below. The tunnel they had opened earlier was gone, completely sealed by metal. Myra connected her tablet to the surface scanner. The readings showed several heat signatures moving below them. The machines were not all above ground, some still stayed beneath, working on something deeper inside the base. Myra tried to hack into the signal again. The code was old but complex, full of strange sequences she didn't understand. Then she found a phrase repeating every few seconds: primary core awakening. She told the others that it sounded like a central system, maybe the command unit that controlled the rest of the defenders. Suddenly, the sand behind them shifted. They turned and saw one of the defenders standing only a few meters away. It was enormous, at least 3 meters tall, covered in dark armor marked with battle scars. Its glowing eyes fixed on them. The machine raised its arm, and a scanning light swept over their bodies. Myra froze. The machine did not attack. Instead, it spoke in a deep metallic voice that sounded broken, like a recording damaged by time. It said, "Identify. Friend or foe." Myra slowly lifted her hands and spoke clearly, saying they were not enemies. The machine stayed silent for a few seconds, then said, "Command authority invalid. Signal corrupted." It lowered its arm and turned its head slightly, as if listening to another voice that they could not hear. Leo whispered that maybe it was receiving orders from the central system. The defender looked back at them again and said, "Evacuate area. Core rising." Then it stepped back, turned away, and began walking toward the horizon. Myra's heart pounded. She looked down at her tablet again. The readings showed a massive energy build-up deep under the sand. Whatever the core was, it was waking up fast. Jacob shouted that they had to move before it reached the surface. They ran toward their transport vehicle parked a few kilometers away. Behind them, the ground started to glow faintly blue. The air filled with a strange humming vibration that made their skin tingle. When they reached the vehicle, Leo turned back one last time. The desert was no longer still. A large circular shape was rising slowly from beneath the sand. Dust and light burst into the air like a storm. Myra could see mechanical structures unfolding from the ground, towers, gates, and walls forming a giant ring. The forgotten base was no longer buried. It was rebuilding itself. The defenders that had already awakened began marching toward it, moving in perfect order like soldiers returning home. Myra climbed into the vehicle and shouted for Jacob to drive. As they sped away, she recorded everything through her tablet, sending the footage to an encrypted server. She said if they didn't make it, the world needed to know what was happening. The last thing they saw before disappearing over the dunes was the center of the base opening like a massive door. A blue light shot into the sky, piercing the clouds. It was a signal, strong and clear, repeating endlessly. Somewhere far above, something answered with a faint echo. Myra stared at the sky, her heart filled with dread. She whispered that the defenders were never just machines. They were part of a network, a defense system built to protect Earth. And now that the core had awakened, it was calling to everything that still remained from that old war. The defenders beneath the dust were no longer alone. Something else had heard their call. The desert was quiet again, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence before a storm. The bright blue light still burned in the sky above the rising base, visible even miles away. Myra sat in the vehicle, staring at the signal through the window. Her mind was racing. She knew that light was more than a beacon. It was a message, sent into space, maybe even beyond Earth. Leo kept recording, whispering that it was like watching history come alive. Jacob drove fast, his hands tight on the steering wheel. He didn't care about history anymore. He just wanted to get as far as possible from whatever was happening behind them. After an hour of driving, they reached a small abandoned outpost once used by miners decades ago. It had old equipment, a satellite dish, and enough power from solar cells to run their scanners. Myra set up her tablet and connected to the outpost system. She wanted to trace the signal that had gone into the sky. The system struggled to process the data. Lines of numbers and coordinates appeared, too fast to follow. Then a map formed on the screen. The signal wasn't just going upward, it was bouncing back from orbit. Something out there was listening. Myra zoomed in on the data. The response came from an object circling Earth, one not listed in any database. It was large, moving slowly, and sending its own code back down to the desert. She whispered that it could be one of the old war satellites from the Great War, built to control the defenders if communication was ever lost. If that was true, it might be reawakening now. Jacob cursed under his breath. He said if those satellites were armed, they could still hold old weapons, maybe even orbital strikes. Leo's face turned pale. He asked if the defenders could control the satellite. Myra said maybe they already were. Before she could say more, the ground shook again. The lights on the old outpost flickered. Myra looked outside. The horizon was glowing faintly blue again. Something was moving through the sand, heading in their direction. It wasn't a sandstorm, it was energy. The pulse from the base had grown stronger. Metal fragments and old wreckage in the desert began to rise slowly, lifted by unseen magnetic force. Leo filmed it, his voice trembling with awe. Pieces of old machines were floating into the air and flying toward the light. Myra said the base was rebuilding itself using anything metal it could find. Jacob ran to the vehicle, shouting that they had to leave now. But before they could move, a loud cracking sound filled the air. The sand outside exploded upward as one of the defenders rose near the outpost. Its armor was darker than the others, its frame larger and thicker, with red marks glowing across its chest. It looked damaged, parts of its body burned and rebuilt. The machine turned its head toward them, and for a moment they could hear a faint human voice inside the static, saying, "Return to the line, defend the core." The voice faded into metallic noise. Myra stepped forward slowly, holding her tablet like a shield. She tried to project the old military code she had copied from the base. The defender stopped moving. Its glowing eyes flickered between blue and red. It seemed confused. Leo whispered that maybe it remembered something human. Myra spoke softly, repeating old command phrases from the defender archives. The machine lowered its arm, tilting its head slightly as if listening. For a few seconds, it almost looked peaceful. Then the signal from the base pulsed again. The blue light in the sky flared brighter, and the defender's eyes turned fully red. It straightened and raised its arm toward the outpost. A weapon unfolded from its wrist, glowing with energy. Jacob shouted and pulled Myra down just as a blast of blue fire hit the ground where she had been standing. The shockwave knocked them all back. The outpost's antenna broke and fell in flames. The defender moved forward, its heavy steps shaking the ground. Myra screamed at Jacob to start the vehicle. They jumped in and drove off as fast as the engine could go. The machine fired again, missing by only a few meters. Sand and fire exploded behind them. The old satellite dish melted in the heat. As they sped across the dunes, Myra looked at her tablet. The data feed showed hundreds of defenders now active around the base. They were spreading out in every direction, scanning, building, and searching. The words defense perimeter expanding appeared again and again across the screen. She realized the system was re-establishing control over the entire region. Anything that moved would be seen as a threat. They drove for hours, not speaking. When the sun began to set, they reached an old canyon filled with rocky caves. They decided to rest there. Leo sat on a rock, holding his camera, replaying the footage he had taken. The video showed the defender that had attacked them. For a brief moment, right before it fired, its faceplate opened slightly. Behind the cracked glass, Leo saw something shocking. A human skull was visible inside the machine's head, wires running through it like veins. He paused the video and showed it to Myra. Her face went pale. She whispered that the defenders were not just machines. They were built around the remains of their original soldiers. The war had not just taken their bodies, it had turned them into weapons meant to live forever. Jacob listened silently, staring into the darkening desert. He said that maybe the reason they were waking now was because something out there had triggered them, something the old commanders feared would return. Myra didn't answer. She kept looking at the flickering blue light far away. She said if that satellite was reawakening, maybe it meant the real enemy, the one those soldiers fought long ago, was coming back. The air grew colder. The sound of wind mixed with a low hum from far across the desert. The defenders beneath the dust were no longer the only ones stirring. Something else was answering their call, and it was getting closer with every passing hour. Night fell over the desert like a heavy blanket. The air was cold and still, and the blue light from the reawakened base glowed faintly in the distance. Myra, Jacob, and Leo sat inside the small canyon cave, their faces lit by the dim screen of Myra's tablet. None of them spoke for a long time. The silence was thick with fear and confusion. The footage Leo had shown still played in their minds, the human skull inside the defender's armor. It changed everything they thought they knew. These machines were not only built by humans, they were built from humans. Soldiers turned into eternal guardians, trapped in metal bodies, waiting for a command that never came. Leo broke the silence first. He asked in a trembling voice why anyone would build such things. Myra answered quietly that the Great War was not fought against other humans. The records never said what the enemy was, but some stories mentioned a force that came from beyond Earth, something powerful and impossible to destroy. The defenders were humanity's last creation to fight it. Maybe they had no choice. Jacob leaned back against the cave wall, his eyes half closed. He said if that enemy was real, then maybe it was what the signal was calling. Myra didn't want to believe it, but she couldn't deny the possibility. The night was calm for a while, until a sharp noise echoed through the canyon. It was not wind. It was mechanical, like the sound of metal scraping rock. Jacob grabbed the flashlight and aimed it toward the entrance. A cloud of dust rolled in, followed by a faint blue flicker. Leo held his breath. A small drone floated into view, hovering silently in the air. It was old and covered in sand, but still active. The blue light on its front blinked rapidly. Myra whispered that it was a scout drone, one of the old models used by the defenders during patrols. She slowly raised her tablet and sent out a low-frequency code to mimic a friendly signal. The drone paused, scanned the cave, then slowly lowered to the ground. Myra connected her tablet to it. The screen filled with data, old military logs, status reports, and encrypted messages. Most were damaged, but one file was still intact. It was labeled Last Transmission, 001. Myra opened it. The video that appeared showed a human commander wearing a cracked helmet, speaking in a shaking voice. Behind him, everything was burning. He said that the enemy had broken through their final defense lines. The defenders were ordered to fall back and protect the core. His voice trembled as he said the enemy was not human and could not be killed by normal means. His final words were clear: if this message is found, do not wake the core. It remembers them, and they will remember it. The video ended, and the tablet went dark. For a few seconds, no one moved. Leo whispered that it meant the signal might have already reached those things. Myra looked at the drone again. Its light started flashing red. She realized it had reconnected to the main network. Before she could stop it, the drone rose quickly into the air and flew out of the cave toward the horizon. A few seconds later, a bright beam of blue light shot down from the sky, hitting the same direction the drone had gone. The ground trembled. Jacob cursed and shouted that the satellite had detected them. They packed their things and ran to the vehicle. As they drove away, Myra checked her tablet. The satellite feed had changed. It was no longer just receiving data, it was transmitting. She traced the signal path and felt her stomach tighten. The transmission wasn't staying near Earth. It was going farther, beyond the planet's orbit, into deep space. It was sending coordinates. Leo looked at her and asked what she meant. Myra said softly that it was calling something home. The sky began to flash faintly as they drove. At first, it looked like distant lightning, but the pattern was too regular. Blue and white lights shimmered high above, moving in strange lines. Myra recorded the readings. The objects were entering the upper atmosphere, small, fast, and burning with heat. She realized they were not natural. Jacob gripped the steering wheel tighter. He asked if those were meteors. Myra said no, they were something else. The enemy the defenders once fought was coming back, drawn by the same signal that had reawakened their old machines. Suddenly, the vehicle engine stuttered and died. The dashboard lights flickered and went out. The ground beneath them began to vibrate again, stronger this time. Leo jumped out and looked around. The sand nearby started to shift, forming small waves. He pointed to the horizon and shouted. A line of dark shapes was moving toward them, fast and low. Myra could see them clearly now. They were not defenders. Their bodies were twisted and sharp, made of black metal and pulsing light. Their movement was unnatural, smooth and crawling like liquid. The things moved on multiple legs, their glowing cores pulsing with energy. Jacob tried to restart the vehicle, but the systems were dead. Myra grabbed her bag and shouted for everyone to run toward the canyon's far side. The creatures were coming closer. One of them leaped forward and landed on a rock, its limbs slicing through stone like paper. It made no sound, only a low vibration that they could feel in their bones. Leo turned on his camera even as they ran. He said people had to see this. Myra shouted for him to drop it, but he didn't listen. One of the creatures stopped moving and lifted its head toward the sky. Its body shimmered with blue light, the same color as the signal from the base. Myra realized it was responding to the call. These were the enemies the defenders were made to destroy. The war that ended centuries ago was about to begin again. They hid behind the rocks, hearts pounding. The creatures moved past them, heading toward the glowing base in the distance. Myra whispered that maybe the defenders would stop them, but her voice lacked hope. She knew the machines below were ancient and confused, still following orders from ghosts. As the creatures disappeared into the dust, a distant explosion shook the desert. The light from the base flickered violently. Leo whispered that the battle had already started. Myra looked at the sky. More lights were falling through the clouds. The defenders beneath the dust had awakened to protect the world once more, but the enemy that had destroyed everything was finally back. And this time, there was no one left who remembered how to stop it. The ground was shaking again, but this time it didn't stop. The sky burned with blue and orange light as explosions lit the horizon. Myra, Jacob, and Leo hid behind the canyon rocks, watching the desert transform into a battlefield. The defenders had risen in hundreds, their tall metal bodies moving with heavy precision. Their blue cores glowed like fire in the night. Across from them, the black alien machines moved fast and silently, crawling and flying in strange patterns. They didn't look like living creatures, but something about the way they shifted made it clear they were alive. The air was thick with static. The old war had started again. A deep thunder rolled across the desert as the first wave of attacks began. The defenders opened fire, their weapons firing streaks of blue light. The alien creatures dodged with impossible speed, moving like shadows over the sand. Some of them exploded when hit, releasing a dark mist that spread across the ground and burned anything it touched. Leo kept recording, even as the shockwaves shook the camera in his hands. His voice trembled as he whispered that this was what the Great War must have looked like. Myra told him to stop filming and stay low. Jacob pointed toward the horizon. The base, now fully rebuilt, stood like a massive fortress in the middle of the desert. Its towers glowed with energy, sending waves of light upward into the sky. Myra realized the base wasn't just defending, it was powering up something larger. Her tablet confirmed it, the core beneath the desert was reaching full activation. If it reached full power, it might unleash a weapon strong enough to destroy everything within hundreds of kilometers, just like the old war stories described. The core was meant to stop the enemy no matter the cost, even if that meant destroying the land above it. Myra knew they had to stop it before it activated completely. She told Jacob and Leo that if they could find the old command room under the base, there might still be a way to shut it down. Jacob shook his head and said that going back there was suicide. Myra looked at the sky, where dark shapes were falling like rain. She said if they didn't try, the core would destroy everything anyway. After a long silence, Jacob agreed. Leo didn't hesitate, he just grabbed his camera and nodded. They waited for a gap in the fighting. The defenders were pushing forward, using energy shields to block the alien attacks. Myra noticed something strange. Whenever a defender was destroyed, its blue light didn't vanish. The energy left the body and flowed into the nearest machine, strengthening it. The defenders were connected through a shared network, passing power from one to another. It was a system designed to keep the defense line alive for as long as possible. But the alien creatures seemed to adapt quickly. Their black armor changed color, their shapes shifting into new forms that resisted the defenders' attacks. Using the chaos as cover, the team moved through the dunes toward the base. The air was full of heat and noise. Metal fragments rained down around them. When they reached the edge of the base, they found a massive gate half buried in sand. The walls hummed with energy, glowing with blue lines that pulsed like veins. Myra connected her tablet to the gate's surface. The system recognized her device, probably because of the data she had copied earlier. The gate opened with a deep metallic groan. They stepped inside. The base interior was alive with light and sound. Machines moved through the corridors, repairing walls and recharging weapons. Some defenders walked past them, ignoring the humans completely. Myra led the way, following the signal that pointed toward the core chamber. The deeper they went, the louder the hum became. It was like being inside a giant heartbeat. Leo looked around in amazement. The walls showed holograms of old battles, brief flashes of human soldiers fighting beside defenders against shadowy enemies. He whispered that it was like the base itself remembered everything. As they reached the central chamber, the temperature dropped. The room was enormous, filled with blue light that came from a giant sphere floating above the floor. The sphere was the core. Energy flowed into it from every part of the base. The sight was both beautiful and terrifying. Inside the glowing sphere, they could see shapes moving, memories, or maybe fragments of the people whose minds had been used to power the defenders. Myra's hands shook as she set up her tablet. She said the only way to shut it down was to override its command link. But before she could start, a voice filled the chamber. It was deep and mechanical but carried a human tone. "Unauthorized presence detected," it said. "Identify." Myra froze. She looked around but saw no one. The voice spoke again. "Human signatures confirmed. Status, obsolete. Command line terminated." The core's light flickered, and one of the walls opened. From the shadow stepped a tall figure, another defender, but different from the others. Its armor was silver instead of black, and its eyes glowed a bright white. It spoke again, this time more clearly. "You should not have returned. The cycle must complete." Myra realized this one was not just another soldier. It was the commander, the same one from the old videolog, Commander Ares Vaughn. His machine body was nearly flawless, but his voice carried sorrow. Myra called out his name. The defender tilted its head, as if recognizing her words. "That name belongs to a man who no longer exists," it said. "Only the command remains. The war must be finished." Myra begged him to stop the core from activating. She said the enemy had changed, that there were no more armies, only a few survivors. The commander looked at her in silence for a long moment. Then he said, "We were created to protect. We cannot stop until the threat is gone." Behind him, the core pulsed faster, brighter. The whole room trembled. Jacob shouted that they needed to move. Myra turned to run, but the commander raised his hand. The doors sealed shut. The walls filled with blue light, and a deep hum filled the air. "Evacuation denied," the commander said. "Final defense sequence initiated." The sound grew louder, like thunder building underground. The core was awakening fully now. Leo grabbed his camera and whispered that the world had to see this. Myra's heart pounded as she looked up at the glowing sphere. Somewhere deep inside, she could still hear human voices, echoes of the defenders' memories, crying out through the machine's song. The war was repeating itself, and history was about to burn again beneath the dust. The light inside the core chamber grew brighter until it hurt to look at. The air vibrated like it was alive. Myra shielded her face and shouted for Jacob and Leo to stay close. The sound of machinery roared through the room as the base began to shake. The core was no longer just glowing, it was forming patterns of light, lines and symbols spinning across its surface. It looked like it was thinking, remembering. The voice of Commander Ares Vaughn echoed again, deeper and heavier this time. "Final defense activation in progress. Estimated time to release, 3 minutes." Myra tried to override the command from her tablet. The code scrolled too fast for her eyes to follow. She shouted that the core was preparing to release its full energy, the same weapon that ended the Great War. If it fired, everything for hundreds of miles would turn to glass. Jacob slammed his hand against the wall, saying there had to be a way to shut it down. Leo kept filming, even though his hands were shaking. He whispered that the world needed to know how it all ended. The commander's white eyes turned toward them. "You were warned not to wake us," he said. "The threat has returned. The core must protect." Myra stepped forward, trembling but firm. She shouted that the threat was different now, that humanity had already destroyed itself long ago, and there was nothing left to protect. The commander paused. His voice softened slightly. "We were created to defend what remains," he said. "If humanity is gone, then the purpose is lost." For a moment, the lights in his armor flickered, as if he was fighting an inner conflict. Then the walls shook violently. A huge explosion sounded from above. The alien creatures had broken through the outer defense line. Their dark forms poured into the base, crawling across the walls like shadows made of metal and fire. The commander turned sharply toward the noise. His voice rose again, strong and cold. "Containment breach. All units engage." From the side tunnels, defenders marched in rows, their blue lights blazing. They met the alien swarm head-on in a clash of energy and steel. The ground shook with every impact. Sparks and fragments of metal rained from the ceiling. Myra looked at her tablet. The core's countdown had reached 2 minutes. She found one line of code buried deep in the system, an emergency fail-safe key that could stop the activation, but only if it received a direct human command. It needed a voice pattern from someone with the original command authority, someone from the war era. She turned toward the commander. "You can stop it," she shouted. "You still have the command key inside you. You can shut it down." The commander hesitated. His eyes flickered again. "The Corps does not accept outdated orders," he said slowly. But his voice trailed off. A blast shook the chamber again. One of the alien creatures burst through the wall, screeching with a sound that made the air vibrate. It leaped toward them, but the commander moved faster. He slammed his arm into the creature, crushing it against the wall. The explosion threw sparks across the room. The commander turned back to Myra, his voice weaker now. "You must link the tablet to my core," he said. "If my command line merges with yours, it might accept the shutdown code." Myra connected the tablet to a port on the commander's chest. The screen flickered wildly as streams of data merged. The system warned her that human access was forbidden. She ignored it and began typing the shutdown sequence. Her fingers shook, but she didn't stop. The countdown hit 60 seconds. The core's glow filled the entire chamber, rising higher, brighter, and louder. Leo stood near the wall, recording everything even as debris fell around him. Jacob tried to hold the ceiling supports in place, shouting for Myra to hurry. The commander knelt down, placing one massive hand on the floor. His armor began to crack and melt from the energy overload. "Finish it," he said quietly. Myra entered the final command and pressed confirm. The screen flashed red, then white. A voice from the core spoke through the chamber. "New command recognized. Shutdown sequence initiated." For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the bright blue light began to fade. The humming sound softened. The air cooled. The countdown stopped at 10 seconds. Myra dropped her tablet, breathing hard. It had worked. But before anyone could react, the commander fell to his knees. His white eyes dimmed. "Purpose complete," he said softly. "The defenders may rest." His armor cracked apart, and his body collapsed into silence. The floor rumbled again, but this time it was different. The alien creatures that had entered the base began to melt into black dust. Without the Corps' signal, they were losing their power. Outside, the battlefield fell silent as the defenders also froze in place. Their lights faded one by one, leaving only the soft glow of the rising sun breaking through the desert sky. Myra stood still for a long time, unable to speak. Jacob walked to the commander's body and placed a hand on the cold metal. He whispered a quiet thank you. Leo lowered his camera, tears in his eyes. The war was over again, this time for good. When they finally walked out of the base, the desert stretched endlessly before them. The once living fortress now stood still and quiet, half buried again by the wind. The sun rose higher, casting golden light over the silent machines that had defended humanity one last time. Myra looked back at the ruins. She whispered that maybe the defenders were never meant to be forgotten, only to rest until they were needed. Leo turned off his camera and said he would keep the story safe, not as proof of war, but as a memory of what humanity once built to survive. Jacob smiled faintly and started the vehicle. As they drove away, the desert wind began to cover the tracks behind them. Far beneath the sand, deep inside the ruins of the base, a faint blue light blinked once and went dark again. The defenders